There's a term that I hear mentioned a lot, and maybe it's just what I listen to, but it's that of the modern myth. But what really is a modern myth? Well, we can start with what it's not. Anyway, there are probably a lot of things that we almost consider mythical nowadays. Things like having a civil conversation with someone you disagree with. Or maybe it's actually people showing common courtesy to others. Or maybe it's just people showing common sense. But those things aren't really myths. They still are present. They just might not be always expressed. And again, depending on where we're looking, it's very easy to see the absence of something, especially on the news and so forth, where stories where it's like people don't treat other people well is part and parcel for the news. It's something to get people to look at. And so that's something to be considered of when we start to think of, oh, this is very rare or this is basically a myth nowadays. Because really, myths are stories. And there is a bit of difference between myths and legends. And that is that legends have a bit more of a historic basis. There may be actual real life people tied to it or real life events that are tied to it. Whereas myths can often be symbolic. Yet, to be honest, they're often used interchangeably. For example, we can think of how often we've heard maybe Arthurian legend or Arthurian myth in regards to King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and just how basically people will refer to them as either or. And after all, why wouldn't they? Because both of these kinds of stories have had a part in shaping the cultures or the cultures they are from, and even other cultures worldwide. Again, King Arthur is apparently very big in Japan. Of course, there are other reasons for because of their interpretations of it, but more on that later. But the thing is that we now have the ability to basically look all over culture, and again, we can think of how the Grecian, the Grecian mythology was taken into the Roman mythology. But I think Rome actually grabbed from a lot of different places, but basically how one mythology became the other mythology. So again, just because a myth is born in one culture does not mean it's not going to be a part of other cultures. And that is almost especially true nowadays where we have this almost worldwide aspect of it. So we're basically learning from all sorts of mythologies and stories of cultures worldwide. And so that naturally will have an impact on us once we've heard them. And I think that also reveals the best qualifier for a modern myth is that it's something that impacts culture, but also lasts. And that's the thing there, because there's often this saying of we need stories to speak to like for almost a modern audience in a sense, but yet people don't really change that much in a sense. There are things that are timeless. Principles like the battle between good and evil, it's one of those things that just gets people entranced almost in the telling of it. It's something that you can do all the time, every time almost. And again, it's like going into things like human nature or the human experience or the principles of this world, just kind of always make things last longer than they do rather than just being like, oh, this is, let's talk about this thing or this thing or this thing or this specific event. We need to really highlight and speak to that even if we're doing it in things. It's when you basically go broad in a sense with the subject matter that you're talking about that you actually create something that lasts. Although you don't necessarily have to go broad, you just have to really see what is the underlying current between things rather than just what is this event and what is this thing going on here, if that makes sense. But the other thing to think of with all this culture thing is that, or the different cultures, is that myths are subject to interpretation. We can go back to Arthurian legends and myths, for instance, and we talked about how Lancelot, who is kind of like one of the main key players, of course, was actually added much later on, and thus even the Grail Trust was basically tacked on later, rather than being part of the original myths and so forth. So there's a lot of little things that kind of change in a myth from when it started to its present day thing. And again, part of that is our views of our cultural lenses on things. Again, you can look at like Grimm fairy tales. Those may not be really myths, but there are kind of stories that kind of have a history of adaptation and sometimes making it more palatable to basically modern audiences in a sense, but but just kind of changing subject matter to make it a bit lighter, I guess. But the thing is that again, we should be aware of interpretation and also what that means, and also when is it good and when is it bad, because again, not everything needs to be translated. Basically, you shouldn't turn something timeless into something that just fits a certain time. I'll probably leave it at that. But anyway, are there any stories you would consider a modern myth? And if so, why not share your thoughts in the comments below? Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, you can like and share it so that others may enjoy it as well. And if you want to see more videos like this, you can subscribe so that you can see more videos like this. Anyway, I'm Jonah, and you've been watching Lionsmane Media, where we celebrate stories and the lessons you learn from them. Talk to you later, and have a great rest of your day.